One of the side effects of the worldwide pandemic is the closure of training classes. In some parts of the world and here in the U.S., many training centers are still closed. In other areas, they're open, but because there's such a backlog of people wanting to get training, it's hard to find a seat in the class. Because of this, many people are learning to ride on their own or with the help of family and friends. So I thought this week we would look at common mistakes that many new riders make, and hopefully we can help a few people out until they're able to actually get into a training class. Hey, my name's Kevin, and I release a weekly video here on MCrider focused on road skills or road strategy to help you become a better rider. Become a member of MCrider, you'll get access to even more tools to help you stay sharp and develop your skills on two wheels. I have so many experienced riders that are members of MCrider, but if you're a new rider, the forums and the field guide have a lot to offer you as well. You'll get access to some of the most knowledgeable riders on the planet who are there to answer questions and provide a very valuable feedback to you. This is not some Facebook group or Reddit group where people are just waiting to find a question or a rider that they can make fun of. And I promise you that it's a politics-free zone as well, which is important right now. We talk motorcycles and motorcycle skills in a family-friendly format, and I believe it's the best rider resource on the web to develop your skills on two wheels. You also get access to the field guide with training exercises that you can do on your own, and many of those are geared towards brand new riders. I can promise you this, I don't promote anything that I don't believe in, and I think the forums and the field guide provide great value for the rider who wants to develop their skills and become a better rider. You can cancel at any time, but I think that you'll like what you find. Just become a member, go to mcrider.com/member, and you can get details on doing so. You know, as a riding instructor, it doesn't take long to notice patterns in the way that people learn to ride. Now, very rarely does someone make a mistake that's totally unique to them. However, I have seen a few exceptions to that rule. One time I was teaching a class and we were going into the cornering exercise. Before the exercise, I reminded the students to turn their head. You know, they want to look in the direction that they want the motorcycle to go. So we got mounted up on the motorcycles, they were out riding, and I was watching. Everyone was doing fine except for one rider, and I was standing at the entrance to the corner just as they were turning in to make a left-hand turn. This rider approached the left-hand turn, so they got the motorcycle leaned over to the right. Instead of doing this, they did that, looking directly at me. And it was so shocking to me. At first, it made me look over my shoulder, convinced that there was something coming up behind me. The rider approached the corner again, laid the motorcycle to the left, did a sharp head turn, this time even further to the right. So the next time through, I waved them down. I got them off the range, and I asked them how their cornering was going. They said, great. I asked them why they were looking to the right, going into a left-hand turn. And they said, because you said to turn our head in the corner. So I slowly said, in the direction of the turn. It sunk in for a minute, and then I heard, oh, I thought that felt weird. And I got the rider back out on the course and looking in the direction of the turn, and it greatly improved their cornering skill. Now, if you've heard me say on this channel before to point your nose in the direction you want the motorcycle to go, this rider is why I came up with that phrase, so that there wouldn't be any misunderstanding in the future, or so I hoped. But aside from the rider looking in the opposite direction of the turn, most of us make very similar mistakes when we're starting to learn to ride a motorcycle, and one of the biggest ones is looking down. Now, this can turn into a habit, and it's one that needs to be broken early. But first, let's look at why riders look down and why it's so common with many new riders. One of the big reasons is they've got all these controls out in front of them. The clutch, the throttle, front brake, the handlebars are all new controls to them. They're directly in front of them, and they're just below their line of sight, so they're looking down at them to control them. So as new riders slowly releasing the clutch, they have a tendency to look directly at that clutch as they're releasing it. They do this either by turning their head to look down at the clutch as they're manipulating it, or some riders, if you told them to keep their head up, you can see their eyes going down and they're looking at that control and their gaze is down, which is just as bad. Now, new riders will often look down as a means of concentrating as well. So you can see it in their face that they have just no awareness of what's going on out in front of them, but they're just staring into space as they manipulate those controls. So they're not thinking about everything that's going on around them. They're just focused on that clutch, and their gaze comes down as a result of it. Now, this bad habit causes a few problems. Probably the biggest is when they get out on the road, it doesn't allow them to see hazards soon enough out on the street. I call this riding in a bubble because all their focus is what's happening within a few feet of the motorcycle. But if they kept their head and eyes up, they could see hazards sooner, and rather than having to use their skills to avoid a crash, they could just make adjustments rather than having to react to them at the last second. Also, looking down causes some mental tricks with the brain. Have you ever been driving in your car and you look out the window at the guardrail that's passing by? It seems like it's going by really fast. But if you look up and look out in the horizon, that sense of speed is greatly reduced and everything slows down. Looking up helps us settle the mind to reduce the stress on the brain by slowing things down. And that plays a big part when we start moving at speed on a motorcycle, keeping your head and eyes up and looking across the parking lot, or when you're on the road, looking out towards the horizon. Looking up also greatly helps your balance. Now, you can see new riders looking down because they're a little more wobbly when they're looking down. You can see them coming up the range. Just try walking across the floor and staring at your feet as opposed to looking on the horizon and walking across the floor. How much more balanced you feel whenever you're looking up. It's going to be the same thing on a motorcycle, and an instructor can see that when you're doing it as well. One of the ways to help train and break this habit early on is you can do it in the garage without ever having to start the motorcycle. Sit on the motorcycle in the garage and practice manipulating the controls without looking down at them. Just get in a good riding posture, relaxed position on the motorcycle, your head and eyes up, your arms relaxed, not tight or stretched out, but just in a relaxed position with a relaxed hold on the grips, and practice rolling on and off the throttle, manipulating the clutch, the brakes. You can keep your feet on the ground, but pretend like you're shifting up and down through the gears. You don't have to put your foot on the gear shift at all. Just, move it up and down on the floor like you're approaching a quarter, what you would do, approaching a stop. Squeeze in that clutch, roll off the throttle. Just practice those different scenarios and do that without looking down at the controls so that it becomes second nature and you build in that muscle memory in order to reach those controls without looking at them. While we're on the subject of gripping the throttle, let's talk about another very common mistake, the way new riders often put their hand on the throttle. So the speed of the motorcycle is controlled in part by rolling on and off the throttle. So, say the throttle's here, a lot of riders will reach out to that throttle with their wrist in a bent position. The problem that causes, you roll on the throttle, right? You're going down the road, and now that feels very normal because your wrist is in a nice relaxed position. It feels normal, but when you roll off the throttle, then your wrist is bent again, and what control is directly in front of the throttle, right? So you reach out, that front brake is there. You're not in the correct position to reach out for that brake. So what happens is you have to release the grip and you reapply your grip, and then you can reach the brake. Or what you see a lot of new riders, what happens, they'll roll off the throttle, their wrist is bent at that point. If it's an emergency stop or a quick stop, a lot of times they'll accidentally roll back on that throttle in attempting to do a quick stop. So that causes problems as well. But if you go to that throttle with your wrist nice and flat, you roll on the throttle from here rather than from here, right? Notice that difference, that bend in my wrist. If you roll on the throttle here, when you roll off the throttle, your fingers are in the perfect position to reach out for that front brake. So you don't have to reapply your grip in order to reach for the front brake. Not only will that shorten your stopping distance up, but that'll break that problem of accidentally rolling on the throttle when you're trying to get in to the brakes in an emergency situation and you need to get there quickly. Now, another very common mistake is trying to control the motorcycle at slow speed with just the throttle, right? So we've learned the throttle controls the speed of the motorcycle, but that's not our only control that we can use to control the speed. And this is perhaps one of the most common mistakes that riders make when they're trying to learn to do U-turns. Now, U-turns are easy when the simple techniques are down, and they're not really that complicated. You have to have the clutch in the friction zone. So what do we mean by the friction zone? If I've got the clutch squeezed all the way in, right, I've got no power to that rear wheel. If I release the clutch fully, I've got full power to that rear wheel. So let's squeeze the clutch in. We'll give it a little bit of throttle on this side. If I begin to slowly release that clutch out, at some point I get partial power to that rear wheel, right? It's not full power, but it's partial power. Holding the clutch in that position so that you've got partial power to that rear wheel is what the friction zone is. So in addition to the friction zone, a little bit of steady throttle. You really want to turn your head and look where you want to go. Also, another benefit to counterweighting is shifting some of your weight in the opposite side of the turn. So what do we mean by that? I'm sitting on a stool here. Let me turn my head. I'm going to leave my upper body, my torso straight. I'll turn my head. I can get just about to my shoulder. Got a bit of a stiff neck this morning. I get just about to my shoulder. But if I shift some weight on this stool and I turn my torso, man, now I can see those motorcycles behind me. I can see so much further back behind me. So by counterweighting, you approach the corner, you got the clutch in the friction zone, you got a little bit of throttle, right? You're using a little bit of rear brake. As you're turning that motorcycle, if you'll shift some weight to the outside of that corner, counterweighting, you can turn your head further through that corner, and I guarantee you that's going to help you make a much sharper U-turn by turning that head and looking where you want the motorcycle to go. If you try to do the same U-turn just using the throttle, it's much more difficult to accomplish, and it'll make the motorcycle lurch forward as you're on and off the throttle. Using the friction zone smooths things out, especially in those U-turn situations. So a lot of riders learn to use the friction zone for U-turns, and then they forget about that technique at other times on the road when slow speed maneuvering is required. The friction zone is also important when you're moving in a straight line, in a stop and go situation in traffic, when you're in a busy parking lot at slow speeds. A lot of times you'll use that friction zone in those situations. When starting a motorcycle from a stop on a steep incline, and a lot of other slow speed scenarios out on the road, using that clutch in the friction zone is a skill that will help you in all kinds of scenarios out on the road. So there are 3 very common mistakes that many new riders make, and I bet there's some pandemic learning riders that are making those mistakes right now as you're learning to ride because you're having difficulty in finding training. But there are many experienced riders that I've seen on the street and come through a training class that are making these mistakes as well. So if you found this video helpful, leave a comment below and maybe we'll continue this series next week, as there's still other very common mistakes that we can get into on this subject that a lot of new riders and experienced riders carry out with them, past their training class. So I hope everyone has a great weekend. Until next week, guys, it's Kevin with MCrider, and I'll see you on the road.